Hey guys, tonight we wander into a place where the air smells faintly of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint, almost buttery sweetness of honey. You're standing at the edge of a medieval village in late autumn. The fields are brown stubble now, the harvest long gathered in. The river runs slow, almost sluggish, reflecting the pale sunlight of short days. In the distance, a thin ribbon of smoke curls from each thatched roof. And near the hedgerow there they are, rows of dome-shaped skeps, their straw sides beaded with dew that turns to frost when the morning breath is cold enough. You probably won't survive this medieval winter, by the way. No central heating, no vitamin C supplements, and your wool socks are, let's just say, less than effective. But for now, you're here to shadow a beekeeper. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, pop into the comments and let me know where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the patchy grass, your boots damp from yesterday's rain. The beekeeper broad-shouldered, a little stooped from years of lifting skeps, waves you over. His tunic is patched in 3 different shades of brown, and a faint buzz seems to follow him like a personal theme song. He crouches beside one of the hives, brushing a delicate layer of frost from the woven straw. This is the season's first warning. Winter is coming fast, and the bees, like the villagers, must prepare. In medieval Europe, bees are not just a hobby. They are a lifeline. Without them, there's no honey to sweeten porridge or ale, no wax for candles to light the long nights, and no beeswax polish to make the Lord's table gleam. Even the church relies on them, for candlelight is not just convenience, it's ritual. Historians still argue whether monastic beekeeping was purely practical or carried deeper symbolic meaning. But here in the village, the motive is simple: survival. You kneel beside the skeps, your fingers tingling from the cold, and feel the faint warmth radiating from inside. The bees are still busy in there, though not in the bustling way of summer. No, their work is deliberate, almost solemn. They huddle together in a tight cluster, vibrating their wings to generate heat. Think of it as the bee version of a group hug, if that group hug also involved thousands of tiny heating pads. The beekeeper shows you how frost on the hive is both a friend and a warning. Too much frost, and it could mean moisture inside, which can be deadly for bees. But a little frost? That's normal, just the breath of the colony meeting the cold dawn air. He leans in, pressing his ear against the hive. Still singing, he murmurs. And you hear it too. A soft, thrumming hum, like distant chanting from a choir that's too polite to wake the neighbors. Nearby, a hen picks at the hard ground, finding nothing. She looks at you accusingly, as though the absence of worms is entirely your fault. You shuffle away, stepping around a half-frozen puddle, your breath making its own little clouds. The beekeeper explains that late autumn is the moment to make final adjustments. Skeps are shifted slightly, so the openings face away from the prevailing wind. Low stone walls, set up during the summer, now earn their keep as windbreaks. In harsher regions, skeps might even be brought into sheltered sheds or alcoves. You run your hand along the coarse straw of the hive, feeling where it's been repaired over the years. These aren't disposable boxes like modern hives. They're living heirlooms, patched and mended season after season. Some skeps have moss tucked into the weave, acting as natural insulation. Others are daubed with a clay and cow dung mix that smells exactly like you think it does, but keeps out biting winds. As you watch, the beekeeper adjusts a flat slate atop one of the skeps. It's not there for style, though in a rustic way, it does look charming. It's there to keep off snow and heavy rain, which could collapse the straw dome if left to soak. He pats it once, satisfied, and moves to the next hive. You glance at the horizon. The sun is sinking already, and it's barely afternoon. Winter in the medieval world is like that days that pass in the blink of an eye, and nights that seem to stretch forever. The bees, the villagers, even you will soon learn to measure time not in hours, but in hearth refills, candle stubs, and the number of times you have to stamp your feet to keep feeling in them. The beekeeper gestures for you to follow him to a small wooden shed near the hives. Inside, bundles of dried herbs hang from the rafters. Thyme, mint, chamomile. These aren't too just for human tea. They'll sometimes be crumbled near the hives to deter pests or keep the air sweet. He shows you a small earthen jar, nearly empty. It's last year's honey, reserved for emergencies. When the snow lies thick and blossoms are only a memory, that honey will keep the colony alive. You step back into the cold, drawing your cloak tighter. The skeps sit silently now in the dimming light, their woven shapes dusted with fresh frost. Somewhere deep inside, thousands of bees hum on, unaware of your watching. And you, strangely, feel warmer for it. There is a sense of quiet determination here, a shared understanding between human and insect that winter is simply something to get through together. The next morning, you wake to a pale winter sun spilling through a gap in the shutters. Its light so thin it feels more decorative than useful. The fire in the hearth has burned down to a few sullen embers. Outside, the ground is stiff with frost, and every step crunches under your boots like walking on sugar. You head toward the hives, breath pluming in the cold, and find the beekeeper already at work, pacing the narrow strip of grass between the skeps and the low stone wall that shelters them. Choosing the right winter shelter for bees isn't as simple as tucking them anywhere out of sight. In the medieval mind, location could mean the difference between a thriving colony come spring and a heartbreaking heap of lifeless bees. Your guide explains that some villagers keep their hives against the south wall of a barn or under the lee of a church, where the sun strikes early, but the wind can't bite so deep. Others set them behind hedgerows, the woven branches acting like a natural fence against gusts. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers understood the full science of microclimates, or if they relied more on inherited habit and folklore. Whatever the case, the results spoke for themselves. The best-kept hives emerged in spring, buzzing with life, ready to forage at the first hint of blossom. The beekeeper takes you to the far side of the yard, where a cluster of skeps rests in a nook between two stout oak trees. The trunks act like sentries, breaking the wind, while overhead the bare branches let in pale winter sunlight. The ground here is dry as small but vital detail, since dampness is an enemy of bees. Cold they can handle. Cold and wet, not so much. You notice a faint scattering of dead leaves around the base of the skeps. They've been deliberately left there to act as a kind of natural mulch, keeping the earth from turning to slippery mud. One skep sits a little apart from the rest, tucked right against a wall built of gray fieldstones. The stones are rough and cold to the touch, but they store the day's sunlight like sleepy radiators, releasing a trickle of warmth as night falls. Your guide grins when you mention it. Yes, it's deliberate. He's even been known to drape an old wool cloak over the top during severe cold snaps. Better to lose a cloak than a colony, he says, shrugging in the way of someone who has learned to value bees over clothing. In harsher winters, entire skeps might be moved indoors. You can picture it, a low, smoky barn, the air thick with the scent of hay and livestock, and in one corner, the bees drowsing in their straw domes, lulled by the soft, constant warmth. It sounds cozy, but the beekeeper prefers them outside if possible. Too much indoor warmth too early can trick the bees into thinking spring has arrived, sending them out to search for flowers that aren't there. A chicken struts by, feathers puffed against the cold, pausing to inspect the frost-rimed entrance of one hive. She seems satisfied with whatever she learns there and moves on. You can't help but laugh quietly. Nature is full of these tiny inspections, creatures making judgments we'll never fully understand. As you move from skep to skep, you notice that each one has its own subtle placement quirks. One is half hidden behind a woven hurdle fence. Another faces a little more east than the others, catching the dawn light first. The beekeeper explains that older hives sometimes get retired to gentler positions, less wind, more sun to give struggling colonies the best chance of making it through. From time to time, you catch a faint vibration under your fingertips when you touch the straw. The bees are in there, tucked deep inside, their bodies forming a living sphere around the queen. Your guide tells you they'll shift slowly over the course of winter, rotating inward and outward like dancers in the slowest waltz ever performed, each taking turns in the warmer center. The stone wall on the north side of the apiary is dotted with tufts of moss and lichen, its top lined with rough slates to keep the worst of the weather off. You imagine this little microcosm from a bee's point of view, a sheltered courtyard, open to the low sun, protected from biting winds, with walls that breathe out warmth even after dark. And then there's the superstition side. You hear how some beekeepers believe a hive should never be placed where a funeral procession has passed that year bad luck. They say, and the bees might desert. Others swear by positioning hives so the morning sun hits them directly, claiming it wakes the bees gently, as though they are little monks needing the bell for matins. Whether these beliefs have merit or not, the beekeeper shrugs. If it works, it works. You stand quietly for a moment, hands tucked into your sleeves. The air is utterly still, as though the village is holding its breath for the season ahead. You feel a strange camaraderie with the bees, all of you tucked into your chosen shelters, waiting for the long months to turn. A morning after the shelters are set, you find the beekeeper crouched low in the pale sunlight, working on something that looks like a lumpy, straw-covered mushroom. As you get closer, you realize it's one of the skeps, halfway encased in a patchwork jacket of straw bundles, moss pads, and yes, clay daub. His hands are red from the cold, but they move with practiced care, tucking, smoothing, and pressing each layer into place. Packing the skeps for winter is part science, part artistry, and part stubborn refusal to let the cold win. You kneel beside him, feeling the roughness of the straw against your palm. It's been tightly woven, but over months of sun, rain, and bee activity, tiny gaps have opened here and there. Today's job is to close those gaps without suffocating the hive. Too much sealing, and you risk cutting off airflow, letting condensation build inside. Cold bees can survive. Wet bees can't. He starts with straw the coarse, golden kind left over from threshing. It's soft enough to mold into the curve of the skep, but firm enough to block wind. Over that, he presses handfuls of moss into the weave. It's springy, smelling faintly of earth and forest. In medieval times, moss wasn't just insulation. It was also used as bandaging for wounds, packing for food storage, and yes, as a kind of natural sponge. The beekeeper chuckles as he tucks it in. Better in the hive than in my boots. Then comes the daub, a thick mixture of clay, water, and a dash of dung from the livestock pen. You catch the smell immediately rich, barnyard, and not entirely unpleasant if you accept that you live in a world without air fresheners. The daub goes on in patches, like plastering a wall, sealing areas most exposed to wind. Historians still argue whether every beekeeper used dung in the mix, or if it was a regional thing. Some say it helped repel certain pests. Others insist it was just because clay was scarce, and dung was, well, readily available. The skep in front of you slowly transforms from a pale, straw dome into a patchwork of textures and colors. Gold, green, and the muted brown of clay. The entrance hole remains clear, a small, arched opening just big enough for a bee to squeeze through. You imagine them inside now, the light from that doorway dimming as the packing builds up outside. It's like drawing the curtains before a long winter's nap. You help by holding bundles of straw while the beekeeper works. Your fingers grow stiff with cold, but the rhythm of the task is strangely soothing. Wrap, press, tuck. Press, smooth, pat. It's almost like dressing a sleeping child for a long journey, making sure every draft is kept at bay. Around you, other hives wait their turn. Some already wear their winter coat straw mats tied in place with rough twine, or woven reed panels leaning against their windward sides. In warmer climates, such heavy wrapping might be unnecessary. But here, in a place where frost can linger until April, every layer counts. You pause to flex your fingers, noticing the faint, constant hum inside the skep. It's lower than a summer buzz, like hearing a crowd from far away. The beekeeper tilts his head toward it, smiling faintly. Still strong, he says. That sound is the colony's heartbeat, and he listens to it the way some people listen to a sleeping loved one's breathing. Not every part of the packing is purely functional. On one hive, you notice a pattern of diagonal lines etched into the clay daub. When you point it out, the beekeeper admits it as an old habit from his father. Keeps the frost from biting too deep, though he winks as he says it, as if it's half superstition. On another, a small sprig of dried rosemary is tied above the entrance. For luck, he says simply. Whether it works for the bees or for the beekeeper, as peace of mind is anyone's guess. By midday, the sun has climbed just high enough to take the edge off the chill. You sit on the low stone wall while the beekeeper finishes the last hive for today. Your boots are dusted with straw. Your gloves smell faintly of clay and moss. You look at the row of skeps, each now wearing its winter armor, and feel an odd satisfaction, as though you've helped tuck in an entire village of tiny neighbors for the season. And in a way, you have. These preparations will decide whether the bees greet the first spring blossoms or remain only a memory. It's a quiet, stubborn act of faith that warmth will return, flowers will bloom, and life will hum again. A week later, frost rims every edge of the village well. The puddles in the rutted lane are thin plates of ice, and the mornings smell faintly of wood smoke and damp wool. You crunch your way toward the apiary and find the beekeeper carrying a small, lidded bucket. He waves you over with a conspiratorial grin, the way someone might beckon you toward a kitchen just before the bread comes out of the oven. Today is feeding day. You wouldn't think bees need help with that. They're famously self-sufficient. But in a medieval winter, the flowers are long gone, the meadows are brown and brittle, and stored honey can run low. Left to themselves, some colonies might not survive until the first blossoms. And so, the beekeeper lends a hand. He sets the bucket on the stone wall and opens it to reveal a thick, amber-like syrup. You half expect him to dip a spoon in and offer you a taste. But this batch isn't for people. It's a special sugar-water mixture, heated just enough to dissolve into a golden, almost honey-like fluid. In warmer regions, bees might be left entirely to their own stores. But here, winters are long enough to make a safety ration worthwhile. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers ever used pure sugar for this, given its rarity and cost, or if they relied solely on leftover honey from stronger hives. Either way, the principle remains. Keep the bees' energy up, and they'll keep their cluster warm. The feeding process feels strangely like a secret ritual. The beekeeper carries the bucket to the first hive and kneels in the frost, moving with slow, deliberate care. From a small pouch at his belt, he pulls a flat, shallow dish, placing it just inside the entrance. He pours a measured trickle of the syrup into it, careful not to spill on the straw. Bees don't mind sticky nectar in the summer sunshine, but in winter, spillage could chill and trap them. You crouch beside him, peering through the entrance hole. It's dark in there, a dim golden glow from the syrup catching the light. Within moments, a few bees stir, drawn by the scent. They approach cautiously, antennae twitching, then dip their heads into the liquid. It's quiet, no frenzied buzzing, no swarming, just the slow, purposeful feeding of a colony that knows every sip matters. Not all the hives get fed today. The beekeeper explains that overfeeding can sometimes harm more than help. Bees need to conserve their stores in an organized way. Too much sudden abundance might disrupt their clustering rhythm. So he focuses on the weaker hives, the ones that sounded a little less robust when he pressed his ear to them last week. At one hive, instead of the syrup, he offers a chunk of capped honeycomb last summer's work from a hive that produced a surplus. It smells faintly of wildflowers in warm days, a reminder that the outside world isn't always frozen. The bees inside will recognize it instantly. Their own wax and nectar return to them like a care package from a past self. A robin perches on the wall, head cocked as if curious about the proceedings. You wonder if it sees the bees as competition for some invisible winter bounty, or if it's just enjoying the faint warmth radiating from the hive. Either way, it stays put, watching each measured pour. While you wait for the bees to settle back into their cluster, the beekeeper tells you how in harsher winters, monks were sometimes tasked with feeding hives near their abbeys, especially if the honey was earmarked for medicinal use. Honey salves for wounds, syrups for sore throats, and of course, the all-important beeswax candles for church rituals. These were luxuries too precious to risk losing to cold and starvation. You help carry the bucket back toward the shed, your fingers numb even through your gloves. Inside, he sets it by the hearth, or it will stay warm enough for tomorrow's round. He stirs the mixture absently, a wooden spoon leaving lazy spirals on the surface. The smell makes you think of summer fields, which is both comforting and faintly cruel in the middle of December. Outside again, you glance back at the row of hives. There is no visible change, just the same quiet domes under their moss and clay coats. But you know that inside, tiny stomachs are full, wing muscles are humming, and a little extra warmth is seeping through the cluster. Winter hasn't won yet. The snow falls lightly today, drifting in slow, lazy spirals, as though even gravity can't be bothered to hurry. The village is quiet. No one wants to be out longer than they have to, and the only sound is the muted crunch of your boots as you cross the yard toward the hives. You find the beekeeper standing completely still, head bowed toward a skep, as if he's listening to the heartbeat of the earth itself. You join him, leaning closer. At first, all you hear is the faint rush of your own breath inside the wool of your hood. Then there it is, a low, steady hum, almost more felt than heard. It's not a cheerful summer buzz. It's deeper, slower, like the bees are chanting in some tiny secret language. You can imagine the cluster inside. Thousands of bodies packed together in a tight ball, the queen in the middle, workers taking turns at the outer edge, vibrating their wings to keep the temperature at a toasty 35 degrees Celsius. The beekeeper gestures for you to try another hive. You crouch, pressing your ear to the rough straw, feeling the faint vibrations through your cheek. This one hums a little higher, a little quicker. Strong, he murmurs. They'll make it. In medieval terms, this simple act of listening is the beekeeper's winter diagnosis. No thermometers, no stethoscopes, just a practiced ear and decades of experience. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers understood the exact mechanics of clustering, or if they thought the sound was simply the bees talking to each other. Either way, they knew that silence was bad news. A hive with no hum is a hive in trouble. You move from skep to skep, pausing at each to listen. Some hum with the deep bass of strong colonies, others with a more tentative murmur. One is barely audible, and the beekeeper makes a small note to himself, likely marking it for extra feeding or inspection later. While you work, a light snow settles on your cloak. It reminds you of icing sugar dusted over a cake, though the cold creeping into your toes is far less appetizing. The beekeeper tells you that in some places, he's seen people knock on the hive or even sing softly to it, the idea being that the bees should know they haven't been forgotten. You picture a row of villagers serenading their hives like old friends. and the image makes you smile. Not all signs come from sound. The beekeeper points to the small entrance hole at the base of one skep. There's a sprinkling of tiny wax crumbs and a couple of pale bee bodies, stiff with frost. Normal, he assures you. Winter always claims a few old workers that have reached the end of their short lives. As long as the entrance isn't clogged, the colony inside will carry on. You pause at a hive near the stone wall, noticing the way the frost has melted in a small ring around its base. That, the beekeeper says, is a sign of healthy internal heat proof, that the bees are generating enough warmth to fight the cold. At one point, you step back and just look at the row of skeps, their domes dusted white, their entrances dark. There's something oddly moving about the thought of so much life hidden inside such still, quiet shapes. No movement, no noise, until you press your ear close and the hum rolls through you like a secret heartbeat. The beekeeper finishes his round, dusting snow from his shoulders. They're holding, he says simply, the way you might talk about a friend recovering from illness. You both linger for a moment, listening one last time to the deep, steady music of survival. The snow is thicker now, a heavy, muffling blanket over the village. Paths are reduced to narrow trenches between drifts, and every rooftop looks like it's wearing a soft white cap. You push your way toward the hives, breath clouding in the air, and find the beekeeper bent over a curious little structure near the apiary fence. It's a box of rough planks studded with iron nails, its lid held down by a stone. He catches your puzzled look and grins. For the thieves, he says. Not the human sort, though he'll get to them, but the winter raiders that think a beehive is the medieval equivalent of an open pantry. You learn quickly that bees have plenty of enemies in the cold months. Mice, for example, love nothing more than to sneak inside a hive, build a cozy little nest, and feast on honey stores while the bees cluster deeper inside. In warmer weather, the colony would eject such intruders in short order, but in winter, when bees are reluctant to break formation, a single mouse can cause chaos. The beekeeper shows you how he nails thin strips of wood across the hive entrances narrow enough to keep rodents out, wide enough for a bee to slip through. Some beekeepers use woven bristles or thorny twigs for the same job. Historians still argue whether these guards were standard practice everywhere or just in mouse-prone regions, but the logic is simple and sound. Then there are the larger thieves. Bears are the most dramatic example, though here in this part of the countryside, they're more legend than daily nuisance. Still, the beekeeper tells you stories he's heard about whole apiaries torn apart in one night, straw and bees scattered across the snow. Whether those tales are truth or just village cautionary lore, you decide not to test it. Human thieves, however, are a more realistic concern. Honey is valuable liquid gold in an age before sugar was common in wax, even more so, prized for church candles and household needs. In hard winters, temptation can outweigh neighborly goodwill. The beekeeper gestures toward the small plank and nail box you saw earlier. It's a kind of lockbox for the most precious skeps. Small enough to be moved indoors, but secured well enough to discourage casual lifting. You notice he's placed some hives closer to his own cottage this year, within sight of the main window. Easier to watch, he says, and you imagine him glancing out during long winter evenings, eyes scanning for movement in the moonlight. Protection isn't just about locking things up. He's also built the apiary's fence a little higher, its woven wattle panels reinforced with extra stakes. The fence does double duty, shielding the skeps from wind and creating an obstacle for any opportunistic honey hunter. While you talk, a small shape darts from the fence line, a weasel, quick as a shadow, vanishing into a drift. The beekeeper shakes his head but doesn't seem worried. They go for the mice, he says. Let them earn their keep. You file that away as another piece of medieval pragmatism. Sometimes the best guard is another predator. As you circle the apiary together, he points out the subtle signs he watches for. tiny paw prints near an entrance, scratch marks on a hive, disturbed straw around the base. Each is a clue, a whisper of who's been nosing around. And each gets a response: extra bracing, a new guard strip, a sprinkling of ash to make fresh tracks more visible next time. It strikes you that guarding bees in winter is a strange mix of patience and paranoia. Most days, nothing happens. But the one night you don't check, that's the night. A mouse moves in, or someone decides your hive would look better in their own yard. By the time you leave, the snow is falling harder, blurring the shapes of the skeps until they look like sleeping animals curled under blankets. You know they're not alone in the cold out there in the darkness. Other creatures are watching, waiting for a chance. But tonight, the fences are sturdy, the entrances are barred, and the beekeeper's watchful presence is the best lock of all. Evening settles in with a soft hush over the village. The sky is a muted gray, snow drifting in lazy flakes, and the distant church bell tolls once, twice, thrice, marking the hour with deliberate slowness. You trudge toward the hives, feeling your boots crunch through crusty snow, and notice the beekeeper, pausing at each skep, hands clasped as if in silent reverence. Today, he wants to show you something you might not expect: prayers for the bees. In medieval Europe, practical work and superstition often wove together like threads in a tapestry. The beekeeper murmurs blessings over each hive, not in the rigid cadence of formal ritual, but in a soft, meandering cadence that seems to float over the snow. He dips his fingers into a small pot of honey and flicks a tiny amount onto the straw top, a gesture meant to invite protection and good fortune. You watch, intrigued, as he whispers words in an old dialect, phrases that echo faintly like lullabies. Historians still argue whether such blessings were genuinely believed to affect bee behavior, or if they were comforting rituals for the beekeepers themselves, a way to ease anxiety during months when control is limited and survival uncertain. Either way, you feel a curious warmth at the practice. Nearby, a cat curls on a straw pile, eyes half closed, ears twitching at the faint hums emanating from the hives. The beekeeper nods to it, as though acknowledging a quiet observer of the ritual. He explains that in some villages, offerings of flowers, breadcrumbs, or herbs were left near hives to honor the spirits believed to guard bees. Today, only the honey flick remains, but the sense of ceremony lingers. You join him, murmuring your own improvised blessing. Your words are clumsy, your accent wrong, but the act feels grounding. You notice that while the bees are tucked deep inside, undisturbed, there is still movement, a subtle vibration, as the cluster shifts. It's almost as if they are aware of the human presence, or perhaps just responding to warmth. The beekeeper chuckles softly. You'd be surprised. He says, how often I hear of bees behaving differently after a blessing. Could be coincidence, could be magic. Historians still argue which. You nod, letting the ambiguity settle over you like a soft quilt. He takes a step back from the hives and gestures toward the horizon. Winter is long. You can prepare, feed, and guard them all you like, but a little hope never hurt anyone. You breathe in the cold air, sharp and clean, letting it fill your lungs, and feel oddly reassured by the ritual. For the rest of the evening, you follow him in small tasks around the apiary, hiding straw bundles, checking moss insulation, adjusting a slate here and there. Each movement is slow, deliberate, almost meditative. The world narrows down to the frost, the hives, the faint hums inside, and the quiet cadence of human care, intertwined with centuries-old superstition. By the time night truly falls, the bees are tucked snugly in their straw and moss castles, protected from wind, cold, and unwelcome visitors. And even the beekeeper seems to exhale a little more easily. You, too, feel a small satisfaction, the kind that comes from witnessing care, ritual, and patience converge in the smallest of living things. The next morning, The frost glitters like crushed diamonds across the village rooftops, and the air carries that faint, sweet edge of snow melting on dry straw. You follow the beekeeper toward the hives again, noticing a sense of anticipation in his steps. Today, you will learn about winter honey uses the small, precious ways that this golden store sustains village life through the darkest months. He kneels beside the first skep, lifting a carefully capped honeycomb. The wax is firm, pale, and faintly fragrant, a memory of summer blooms captured in hexagonal cells. This, he says, tapping it gently, is medicine, dessert, and light, all in one. Medieval villagers prized honey not only for sweetness, but for its medicinal properties. It was used to soothe sore throats, dress wounds, and even calm fevers. A spoonful might accompany a bitter tea, making it easier to swallow and far tastier than plain herbs. You listen as he explains, showing small jars labeled in fading ink with their intended use. One jar is for personal consumption, another reserved for communal feasts, and a third for candle making. Beeswax candles, he notes, burn cleaner and longer than tallow, and churches rely on them for services, especially in the long nights of winter. Historians still argue whether the religious demand for wax drove beekeeping more than domestic needs, but the connection is undeniable. Bees and faith intertwined like thread and loom. The beekeeper opens a tiny lid on a jar of winter honey and lets you dip a finger into it. The flavor is surprisingly complex hints of clover, thyme, and whatever wildflowers survived the last season. He smiles at your raised eyebrows. "It's liquid sunlight," he murmurs. You think that might be exaggeration, except for the way it seems to brighten even the grayest winter morning. You follow him to another hive, where he carefully cuts a small piece of comb and hands it to you. Some of it will be used to sweeten porridge, a rare treat during this lean season. Some will be dissolved into medicinal syrups, and the remainder set aside for ritual purposes, from church offerings to small household blessings. Even a tiny portion represents hours of labor and careful tending by both bees and humans. The beekeeper tells you about a curious tradition. Midwinter feasts often feature honey cakes or small sweets made from last year's stores. He chuckles as he explains that villagers sometimes joke about stealing summer's warmth, referring to the way honey captures the essence of months past. You imagine the delight of children tasting honey after months of bitter grains and root vegetables. While you move from hive to hive, he points out the subtle differences in each colony's honey. One batch is darker, almost amber-black, with a robust, earthy flavor. Another glimmers pale gold, light and delicate. He murmurs that bees, like people, each have their own personalities, and their honey reflects that. Historians still argue how much variation medieval keepers could truly detect, but centuries of experience suggest the subtleties were anything but imaginary. Finally, he demonstrates candle making. Strips of beeswax are dipped in warm honey water, twisted carefully, and left to cool. A faint scent of honey drifts around you, a quiet comfort in the cold morning. It's mesmerizing to watch, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seems almost magical. One dip, two, three, until the candle stands ready, small and golden, a miniature beacon for winter nights. By the time you step back, the sun has climbed just enough to turn the frost into sparkling crystals. You feel the weight of the honey's importance, not just as food, but as medicine, light, ritual, and memory. In the quiet of a medieval winter, the bees' work nourishes every sense of survival, in ways both practical and poetic. By late January, the cold is no longer a novelty. It presses against you like a damp wool blanket that refuses to let go, seeping into your bones. The beekeeper trudges ahead of you on the narrow path, boots crunching over a crust of frozen earth. Today, he says, you will learn the art of midwinter hive inspection, a delicate balance between necessary care and not disturbing the bees' fragile winter rhythm. You arrive at the row of skeps, their straw domes lightly dusted with snow. He kneels beside the first hive and rests his ear against it, motioning for you to do the same. At first, you hear nothing, only the faint hum of the village beyond. But then, slowly, like a kettle just beginning to simmer, a low, steady buzzing emerges from within. That, he whispers, is the sound of a healthy winter cluster. In winter, bees form a tight ball around the queen, generating heat by vibrating their wings and bodies. They shift positions over time, allowing each bee a turn in the warmer center. This communal heating is their survival mechanism, and opening the hive too often risks letting that precious warmth escape. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers fully understood the biology behind this behavior, but they knew enough to avoid meddling without cause. The beekeeper uses a small wooden stick to gently tap the hive, just enough to gauge the colony's liveliness. The hum grows briefly louder, then settles again. He nods with quiet satisfaction and moves to the next. This ritual repeats with each skep, the rhythm hypnotic. Crouch, listen, tap, pause. You find yourself holding your breath, as though exhaling too loudly might disturb them. Between inspections, he shares a curious fact. In some regions, beekeepers would sing softly to the hives during winter checks, believing the bees recognized familiar voices. You imagine the sound drifting over frosty fields, a lullaby for insects that want to see sunlight for weeks. Whether the bees truly noticed or not, the tradition persisted, blending practical care with human affection. At one hive, the hum is weaker. The beekeeper frowns slightly and instructs you to fetch a small jar of honey from his basket. Carefully, he smears a thin layer on a flat wooden board and slides it into the hive entrance. This is winter feeding emergency rations for a colony whose stores might be running low. He explains that it's a risky act. Too much opening, and the heat loss could kill them. Too little, and they starve before spring. You begin to understand why beekeeping in winter is more about restraint than action. As you move to the last hive, the snow begins to fall again, thick, lazy flakes that soften the world around you. The beekeeper tilts his head up and remarks that bees can sense changes in weather even when sealed inside. You half expect him to claim their tiny profits, but he shrugs and says only, "They just know." Historians still argue whether bees respond to atmospheric pressure or subtle temperature shifts, but medieval keepers noticed the pattern centuries before modern science caught up. When the inspection ends, you walk back toward the cottage, the sound of that low buzzing still lingering in your ears. You realize it is not just the bees you've been hearing. It's the heartbeat of the entire winter, steady and constant, waiting for the thaw. Inside, the beekeeper pours hot water over dried herbs and hands you the steaming cup. You sip slowly, feeling the warmth spread through your fingers, thinking of the bees huddled in their dark straw homes, riding out the season with the same quiet endurance. There is something deeply reassuring about their persistence, about how survival often comes not from grand gestures, but from small, steady acts repeated until spring returns. The days begin to lengthen, just barely, but the air is still sharp enough to make your nose sting. The beekeeper says this is the season of patience, when doing nothing is often the hardest part of the job. You follow him out to the hives once more, your breath puffing white in the morning chill. Today's task is not to feed or inspect, but to protect. Midwinter storms can undo weeks of careful work if wind or snow breaches a hive's shelter. He walks the row slowly, checking the wooden windbreaks and straw wrappings you helped secure earlier in the season. A loosened cord here, a sagging thatch panel, there are small vulnerabilities that, if ignored, could mean death for hundreds of bees. He pauses at one skep, whose entrance is partially blocked by ice. With gloved hands, he chips away at the frozen crust, careful not to shake the structure. Bees need ventilation, even in the cold, or moisture will build inside, condense on the hive walls, and drip onto the cluster below. Cold air they can survive. Dampness is their silent enemy. Historians still argue whether medieval keepers fully understood condensation as a killer, but their wintering techniques show they recognized the danger well enough to guard against it. The beekeeper shares a curious trick he learned from his grandfather. In deep snow, they'd carve little tunnels leading up to the hive entrance, allowing air to flow while keeping the path shielded from wind. It sounds almost architectural, tiny medieval subways for bees, but it works. You can't help but picture some long-ago villager crouched in the snow, carving bee doorways while the church bell tolled in the distance. A gust of wind sends loose snow swirling into the air, and he mutters something about storm breath before quickening his pace. You suspect this is not an official meteorological term, but it paints the day well enough. He lifts a fallen branch off one hive's roof and sets it aside, muttering about how nature will always test your knots. You find yourself quietly rooting for the hives, as though they were underdog contestants in some wintry endurance challenge. Halfway down the row, he points out a hive with an odd patch of discolored straw. "Mouse," he says flatly. Winter is as much about keeping predators out as keeping warmth in. Mice, drawn by the scent of honey and shelter, will chew their way inside, destroying comb and eating stores. In medieval times, beekeepers sometimes set tiny traps baited with crumbs, or placed sprigs of mint and tansy near the entrances, believing the smell would deter rodents. Whether mint actually works or not, historians still argue, but you can imagine the satisfaction of trying any remedy that didn't require dismantling a skep in the snow. The inspection ends with him tightening the last rope on the final hive. The work feels almost invisible adjustments measured in inches, moments measured in minutes, but in the quiet rhythm of winter care, each tiny act has weight. As you turn to leave, you notice the snow has stopped, and a pale sun hangs low behind the clouds, offering light if not warmth. Back at the cottage, the beekeeper leans his staff by the door and says simply, "Now we wait." Waiting, it seems, is its own form of labor. You settle near the hearth again, tea in hand, feeling the tension between vigilance and rest. The bees, too, are waiting, wings folded, bodies pressed close, carrying the hum of survival through the long, slow hours until spring. And as you watch the fire crackle, you realize that in a winter world, even doing nothing can be an act of care, so long as you be ready when the moment comes to act again. By late January, the snow lies in thick, unmoving sheets, like white cloth draped over every curve of the land. The beekeeper insists on visiting the hives despite the biting wind, explaining that even in the coldest months, you must listen to them. Not in a poetic way, well, maybe a little, but quite literally. You follow him through the crunching snow, each step squeaking like a creaky floorboard. At the first skep, he kneels, presses one ear to the straw dome, and closes his eyes. You hold your breath, thinking he's meditating, but then he leans back and says, "Good, steady hum." The hum is life. It's the sound of thousands of tiny bodies vibrating their wing muscles to generate heat, keeping the queen at the warm, stable core. The pitch changes subtly depending on their condition. Too quiet might mean the cluster is shrinking. Too frantic could mean they're burning through stores too quickly. Historians still argue whether medieval keepers could reliably interpret these tonal differences, but records from abbeys suggest monks kept detailed notes on hive sounds, as though compiling the first bee audiology reports. At the next hive, the sound is faint. A beekeeper frowns, then digs a small trench in the snow to clear the entrance fully. "More air," he murmurs. This is one of those moments when the line between superstition and skill blurs. You can be sure if the action is scientifically sound, or just a ritual passed down through centuries. But it feels right, and maybe that's what matters. Halfway along the row, he shares a peculiar tidbit. Some medieval beekeepers carried little wooden whistles in winter. If a hive fell too quiet, they'd play a short note, believing the bees would stir as if answering a roll call. Whether it worked or was just a way to pass the time in the cold, you can't tell, but you like the image of a frosty field dotted with hives, each one being serenaded by a lone whistle in the snow. The wind picks up, and for a moment, you hear only the hiss of air across the drifts. He cups a hand to one skep like someone checking a door for heat, then nods. They're fine. It's oddly reassuring, like a doctor's visit without the bill. Walking back, he talks about the fine balance of winter bee life, how the cluster shrinks to conserve warmth, how bees rotate positions so no single member freezes at the edge for too long, and how they sometimes uncap honeycomb just to lick the surface before resealing it. It's not waste, it's life support. You ask what happens if a hive doesn't make it. He answers with a shrug that's not cold, but pragmatic. Then you start again. Bees don't owe us forever. There's something almost monastic in that acceptance, as though he's repeating a creed learned over years. Back at the cottage, you can still feel the hum in your ears, a low, steady vibration that might be real or just imagined. The beekeeper sets a small beeswax candle on the table, lights it, and says this is the only way to bring some of their summer into the depths of winter. The flame flickers, releasing that faint, sweet scent, the smell of sunlight, stored in hexagons months ago. As the wax pools slowly at the base, you find yourself sinking into that same patient rhythm the bees keep. The world outside might be frozen solid, but somewhere in those domes of straw, life is quietly warming itself through the coldest nights. And the thought settles over you like a blanket. Not every hum needs to be loud to matter. By February, the snow is a little thinner, but the cold seems sharper, almost metallic in the air. The beekeeper takes you out to what he calls the midwinter way in, and you quickly realize this isn't tea about standing on scales. Less about knowing exactly how much food the bees still have left. He doesn't lift the hives, at least, not fully. Instead, he tilts each one gently from one side, as though testing the heft of a basket of apples. Heavy is good. Too light means trouble, he mutters. You try the same, and are startled at how much you can tell from that small motion. There's a satisfying stability to a hive that's still stocked with honey, and a worrying emptiness to one that feels too light. Here is where the real judgment call comes in, deciding whether to feed them or let them be. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers had a standard approach. Some believe they kept spare honeycombs from summer, specifically for emergencies. Others say they fed bees a paste of honey and ground grain, or even mead diluted with water, though that sounds suspiciously like an excuse to open a fresh jug for themselves. The beekeeper shares a quirk from an old text he once read. Certain monks swore by feeding bees warm beer in late winter. Supposedly, the yeast and barley fortified their spirits. You imagine an entire apiary of slightly tipsy bees, wobbling around in slow, drunken loops. He laughs at the image, but quickly adds, "Beer's probably more for the beekeeper's spirits than the bees." He pulls from his bag a cloth bundle containing something thick and sticky candied honey mixed with ground herbs. "My grandfather's recipe," he says, placing a chunk directly over the top bars of the lightest hive. The smell is rich, and you can almost see the faint steam rise into the cold air. "They'll find it," he assures you, as if the bees have a built-in GPS for sweetness. What's striking is how restrained all of this is. No frantic interventions, no obsessive hovering, just measured observation and small, precise offerings. In a way, it feels more like tending a fire than managing livestock, feeding it only enough fuel to keep it alive, but never smothering it. While you work, the beekeeper tells a story about a village keeper who once tried to wake his bees with bells in February, hoping to get them active sooner for an early spring. The experiment ended with most of the colony burning through their stores before the flowers bloomed. Nature's clock doesn't need our setting, the beekeeper says, tossing the snow from his gloves. It's a reminder that rushing bees is like rushing bread to rise. you'll only ruin the outcome. As the day fades, the sky turns a pale violet, and the hives are once again little dark humps in the snow. You notice you're starting to think about them differently, not as boxes to be checked on, but as quiet, breathing rooms full of patient work. You even imagine them holding tiny winter meetings inside, discussing how best to ration their honey and whose turn it is to be on the chilly edge of the cluster. The last task is to sprinkle a thin layer of ash around the hive bases. The beekeeper says it's to deter mice, who sometimes sneak into the warmth. Apparently, medieval keepers used everything from ash to crushed mint for the same purpose. One old record claims that some swore by circling the hives 3 times while sprinkling ash and muttering a charm about keeping the queen's court safe. He doesn't do the muttering, but you suspect he might, quietly, when no one is watching. By the time you head inside, your fingertips are numb, but your mind is oddly warm. The bees are settled, the hives have been weighed and fed, and the snow seems less like a threat and more like a blanket pulled tight around them. And as the fire in the cottage crackles, you find yourself leaning toward the idea that care, in its simplest form, is just paying attention, tilting, listening, feeding, and trusting the rest will sort itself out. By late February, the light lingers a little longer each afternoon, and the beekeeper insists you take note of it. The sun's return tells the bees it's almost time, he says, though he's quick to add that almost can still mean several more weeks of winter. You follow him out to the hives on a day when the snow has crusted over into a slick, icy shell. Each step crunches sharply underfoot. The hives are still wrapped, but the beekeeper leans in close to listen, his ear pressed against the wood. You do the same and catch that faint, rhythmic hum again, low and steady, like a far-off engine. They're shifting the cluster, he explains, creeping toward whatever stores are left. This is the most precarious time of year for a colony so close to spring, yet still trapped in the hunger gap before fresh nectar appears. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers had ways to predict exactly when this transition happened. Some sources hint they looked for signs in the frost on the hive entrances, claiming certain patterns revealed whether the bees were still strong. Others believe it was pure intuition, honed over decades of observation. Today, you're not opening the hives at all, just checking entrances and clearing blockages. Snow and ice sometimes seal the tiny holes, and the bees inside, in their desperate need for fresh air, can suffocate. You scrape gently with a gloved hand, the frost snapping away like brittle glass. A beekeeper tells you about a 14th century record from Germany that describes keepers using warm breath to melt such blockages, though he warns against trying it. Condensation could freeze right back. Then comes a peculiar chore, scattering crumbs of dried herbs, thyme, sage, and rosemary at the hive entrances. It's an old habit passed down in his family, supposedly to remind the bees of summer. Whether it works is anyone's guess, but you find the scent unexpectedly cheering, especially against the stark cold. You picture a few bees inside, catching the faint aroma and dreaming if bees can dream of warm meadows and clover blossoms. The beekeeper also checks for predators. This time of year, starving birds have been known to peck at hive entrances, hoping for a snack of sleepy bees. In medieval times, keepers sometimes hung small cloths dyed bright red or blue near hives to scare birds away, believing the colors mimicked fire or dangerous flowers. Whether or not that's true, he admits, it looks festive at least. A quirky detail slips into the conversation. Certain monastic orders reportedly rang a small bell at the hives in late winter, partly to bless the bees, partly to signal the changing season. You imagine the faint chime carried across a frozen courtyard, bees deep inside their dark cluster, utterly unaware that their keepers are ceremonially rooting for them. As you walk back, the beekeeper points out the early signs of thaw drips from the eaves, patches of bare ground where the sun hits strongest. Soon, Those bare patches will host the first flowers of the year's snowdrops. Maybe crocuses and the bees will make cautious flights, but not yet. Patience, he says again, and you find the word has become almost a refrain of this whole winter. Inside the cottage, he sits by the hearth, slowly oiling the hinges of a hive tool. You notice the care he gives to even the smallest bit of gear. It matches the rhythm of the season, quiet, deliberate, with no wasted energy. It's a kind of stillness you've grown to appreciate, even if you're not naturally wired for it. And as you settle into a chair, the hum of the bees still faint in your ears. You realize that keeping bees through winter is less about doing and more about watching, learning to hear what they need without forcing your own timetable on them, which you suppose is a lesson that outlives any single winter. The first true warm day arrives almost without warning. Not a balmy summer's day, just enough sun and stillness that the air loses its bite, and a thin sheen of meltwater trickles along the cottage path. The beekeeper calls it a cleansing day, and you'll soon see why. Out by the hives, the snow has shrunk back into uneven drifts, and the entrances are clear. Then you notice movement, a bee, then another, tumbling out into the cold light. They're sluggish, unsteady, but determined. This is their first flight in months, not for nectar, but for something far more basic, to relieve themselves after a long winter of holding it in. You stifle a laugh, because there's something oddly relatable about their urgency. In medieval beekeeping manuals, often more poetry than practical guide, this moment was described in grand terms, as if the bees were emerging to greet the sun with ceremonial dignity. In reality, the scene is a bit messier, with bees dotting the snow with yellow spots as they zigzag clumsily before diving back into the hive. Historians still argue whether keepers in colder climates ever brought hives indoors for these flights, setting them in sunlit courtyards just for a few hours. Some argue it was done only with the most precious colonies, while others doubt the risk of moving them midwinter was worth it. The beekeeper watches each entrance like a stage manager at a play. He counts how many bees come and go, how strong their flight looks. A steady stream means the cluster has survived intact. A sparse trickle or none at all means trouble. One hive shows worrying signs. Only 2 bees emerge, and one doesn't make it back. The beekeeper frowns, but says nothing, only brushing a bit of frost from the landing board. To cheer the mood, he brings out a small jar of honey from last year, diluted with warm water, and leaves a shallow dish near the weakest hive. In the Middle Ages, some keepers swore by offering diluted mead instead, believing the trace alcohol warmed the bees' blood. Modern beekeepers roll their eyes at that one, but you can't help imagining a slightly tipsy Bumble wobbling back to the hive. Then comes a quieter task, inspecting the ground around the hives. He's looking for dead bees. A few here and there are normal winter casualties, but piles could mean disease. Today, the ground is mostly clean, and he brushes away what he finds with the same careful respect you've seen all winter. He tells you about an odd practice recorded in 15th century France. Keepers speaking to their bees after a long absence, as if reintroducing themselves. They believed it kept the bees loyal, he says, adding with a smirk, "I suppose it can't hurt." He leans toward one hive and murmurs a few words in his native tongue, low enough that you can't quite catch them. The sun dips quickly this time of year, and as the warmth fades, so does the bees' activity. One by one, they disappear back into the dark hive, sealing the entrance with the faintest scent of wax and propolis. You feel a quiet satisfaction, like watching the closing scene of a long, slow play that's not quite over, but has reached its turning point. Back inside, the beekeeper sits at the table with his ledger. You see neat columns, hive numbers, dates, cryptic notes about flights and feedings. He pauses now and then, staring at the page as if weighing what's worth recording. You realize that the work of a winter isn't only in tending hives, it is also in remembering, so the next winter can be met with fewer surprises. By the fire, you both fall into a silence that feels earned. The bees have made it to this first warm day. Not all of them, perhaps, but enough. The worst is behind them. Though not behind you entirely, there's still the thin, risky stretch before the first real bloom. But tonight, the hum from those hives outside sounds different, looser, maybe, or simply more alive. The true thaw begins so subtly, you almost miss it. One morning, instead of the muffled quiet you've grown used to, there's a faint dripping everywhere water falling from the eaves, sliding off branches, pattering onto the bare patches of earth that have begun to show through the snow. You walk out to the hives, boots sinking into soft mud, and the air smells unmistakably different. Not just wet, but alive. The beekeeper is already there, leaning on his cane and squinting at the sun. "It's time," he says simply, and you know exactly what he means. The winter lids come off for the first proper inspection since autumn. The smell that rises from the hive is warm, waxy, and faintly sweet, the same scent you first caught months ago. Only now, it's richer, more complex. As if the bees have been brewing it all winter long. Historians still argue whether medieval beekeepers opened their hives this early. Some accounts suggest they waited until fruit trees bloomed, while others describe impatient farmers prying lids up at the first sign of warmth. The risk, of course, was that an unexpected frost could undo weeks of the colony's progress. But medieval life was full of calculated gambles, and for a beekeeper, spring was always a wager. You lean in close and watch the bees bustle about inside, moving over the comb in purposeful patterns. Their sound is different, now not the steady winter hum, but a shifting, layered buzz with little bursts of higher pitch. The beekeeper explains that this is what it sounds like when a colony feels confident again. There's brood to tend, pollen to collect, flights to plan. It's also the moment when you check food stores. The beekeeper lifts a frame heavy with capped honey and nods with satisfaction. In leaner winters, medieval keepers might have fed their bees a candied honey loaf, a thick, hardened mixture of honey and flour placed directly on the comb. It wasn't ideal nutrition, but in desperate times, it kept colonies alive until flowers returned. Outside the hives, the world is shifting too. You spot the first green shoots pushing through the slush by the fence line. The air is full of tiny, darting shapes bees, taking cleansing flights, orienting themselves to the hive entrance, looping in wide circles before diving back inside. You feel oddly protective, like you want to shout at the wind to be gentle with them. The beekeeper tells you one last bit of folklore. In some medieval villages, the first bee seen flying in spring was considered a sign of the season's fortune. If it flew east, the year would be prosperous. West, lean. North, cold. South, wet. You glance up, track a single bee as it spirals away, and smile. Who's to say it isn't true? By the end of the day, your boots are caked in mud, your coat smells faintly of smoke and beeswax, and your hands are sticky from lifting comb. You're tired, but it has a different kind of tired than in winter. It has the good fatigue of starting again. That night, lying in bed, you think back over the months, the muffled snowfalls, the sharp wind at your neck, the quiet hours tending sleeping hives. It's strange how much of winter beekeeping is about not doing just watching, waiting, and trusting. And now, as the first warmth settles over the land, you realize the bees have made it through, and so have you. Now the season turns. The air outside your window is softer, though it still carries the ghost of winter's bite. Somewhere, just far enough away that you can't quite place it. Water is running clear, cold, and constant through a ditch or over stones. In your mind, the hives are quiet again for the night. Their hum low and steady, the bees clustered not from fear of cold, but from the simple instinct to rest. You imagine the comb inside, each cell precise and glistening, the queen moving slowly over them, her attendants following in her wake. There's no rush here. Nature doesn't sprint into spring. The flowers will open when they choose. The sun will linger longer each evening, and the bees will follow that slow rhythm, just as they have for centuries. The beekeeper's words drift back to you. Everything in its season, nothing before its time. You picture him at the apiary, leaning on his cane, watching the light fade across the hives. There's a deep comfort in knowing that the same work, the same patience, the same small acts of care have carried people and bees alike through countless winters before this one. Let your thoughts follow that hum, low and unbroken, the sound of 1,000 tiny wings folded in stillness. Let it wrap around you like the warmth of a hive on a cold morning. Your breathing slows. The night settles. The bees are safe. You are safe. And as the last threads of the day dissolve, you drift toward sleep, carried on the quiet certainty that winter always yields to spring, and every season comes round again. Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into a moonlit banquet hall somewhere along the Nile, maybe around 1300 BCE. The air hums with low chatter and the faint strum of a harp, and the first thing you notice is not the gold, not the towering piles of figs, but the strange little cones perched atop people's heads. Some glisten faintly, others are already softening, sending delicate ribbons of perfume down into carefully oiled wigs. It's an odd look, half-fashion statement, half-melting dessert, but here in ancient Egypt, this is peak party style. You probably wouldn't survive the heat in all that finery, but you'd smell absolutely amazing on the way out. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move further inside, brushing past a curtain of papyrus reeds, and the scent hits you full force: sweet myrrh, honeyed lotus, and something spicy you can't quite name. It's the kind of fragrance that makes you close your eyes and tilt your head back, letting the whole thing wrap around you like warm silk. This is no accident. Every note has been chosen, blended, and placed in those cones with a purpose. You see one guest, possibly a high official, adjust his wig as a rivulet of melted perfume trickles down toward his neck. He looks blissful, as though this slow melt is a form of luxury no one should ever rush. Your eyes drift upward to the hall's high ceiling. Oil lamps flicker, casting shifting halos of light that bounce off alabaster jars and copper trays. These same jars once held the raw materials: beeswax, animal fat, powdered resins that perfumers coaxed into shape. In this heat, the cones give themselves up gradually, each drop releasing a burst of scent stronger than the last. You imagine the fragrance mixing with the aroma: grilled goose, fresh bread, and pomegranate wine. It's an olfactory tapestry, and right now, you're stitched right into the middle of it. Some guests laugh, their voices muffled under the music of long-necked lutes. A dancer sways by, her own cone perfectly balanced atop her hair. It's smaller than the men's, the wax tinted a pale pink to match her linen dress. With each step, the air stirs, carrying her perfume toward you. You can almost taste it, faintly resinous, faintly floral, and utterly intoxicating. A man next to you murmurs about the batch being particularly fine tonight. Imported oils from Punt, perhaps, or from further south near Nubia. He's not sure, and honestly, neither are you. Historians still argue whether these cones were purely for scent, or if they had deeper symbolic meanings, offerings to the gods, maybe, or signs of readiness for celebration. You spot the host at the far end, a woman draped in shimmering linen so sheer it catches the lamplight like water. Her cone is taller than the rest, topped with a pinch of crushed petals that seem to glow. It's not just ornamentation. It's a declaration. She's the center of the scent storm, and she knows it. A quick aside, you're starting to suspect that in this society, the size of your scented cone might be directly proportional to how important you think you are. A servant glides past, refilling cups of beer and wine, and you catch sight of a small tray holding fresh cones, each wrapped in thin papyrus to keep its shape until the moment of presentation. The perfumer himself, a wiry man with henna-stained fingers, hovers nearby, keeping watch like a jeweler over rare gems. You wonder what secrets he knows about balancing aromas so that they release in just the right sequence through the evening. The music swells, and you catch fragments of gossipland disputes, temple renovations, a rumor about a crocodile the size of a barge. But even the juiciest talk can't compete with the sensory pull of the room. Every breath you take is layered first the smoky warmth of burning lamps, then the lush sweetness of the cones, and the faint tongue of the river drifting through an open window. You realize that if the goal is to seduce the senses into forgetting the heat, the dust, and the bugs, then mission accomplished. Your seat is a low-cushioned bench near a carved column. From here, you can see how the cones behave over time. They start sharp and structured, like miniature temples of wax, but gradually slouch, their edges softening until they resemble melted candles. It's strangely satisfying to watch. One older man wipes a drop from his forehead, smearing it over his cheek like a perfumed lotion. Another guest scoops a fingertip's worth from the top of his cone and rubs it into his beard, closing his eyes in what can only be described as olfactory bliss. The night stretches on. Plates are replaced, cups refilled, and somewhere outside, a donkey brays like it's auditioning for the orchestra. A cool breeze drifts in, stirring the hanging reeds, and the scent shifts again lighter now. More floral, as the last reserves of the cones give themselves up. It's a gentle reminder that luxury here is fleeting. The cone will melt away, the night will end, and tomorrow, the hall will smell only faintly of what once was. But for now, in this precise moment, you are part of the rarefied air, breathing in history's most fragrant party trick. The next morning, you find yourself wandering through the quiet streets of the city, long before the market stalls open. The party's energy has faded into the cool, pale light of dawn, but traces of last night still cling to the air. Somewhere, someone has left a window open, and you catch a faint echo of the scent myrrh, lotus, and beeswax like a ghost that refuses to leave. You're curious now. Where did these perfumed cones actually come from? Who first thought of melting fragrance directly onto a guest's head instead of, say, rubbing oil on their skin? So you start following your nose literally. A trail of aroma leads you toward the artisan quarter, where craftsmen and women are already stirring awake. The perfumer's workshop is tucked behind a stall selling copper bowls. From outside, it looks humble mud brick walls, a reed roof, but step inside, and you're hit with an overwhelming sensory explosion. Shelves line the walls, each crammed with small jars sealed with clay stoppers. Some are filled with sticky resin that glints in the light. Others hold dried petals, pale and fragile as moth wings. The air is warm and dense, and you can almost hear it hum. A man with silver hair greets you with the faintest bow. His fingers are stained deep amber from years of working with resins. "You're here for the cones," he says, without a question mark. His voice is soft, but there's an edge to it, like he knows exactly how rare his craft is. He gestures to a low table covered with tools, tiny bronze scoops for measuring powders, smooth stones for grinding, and a small copper pan resting over glowing embers. He drops a lump of resin into the pan, and in seconds, the room blooms with a scent so rich you have to close your eyes. "You start with the base," he explains. "Beeswax, tallow, or sometimes the fat of the ox if you want it to last longer." He lifts a clay pot and stirs its contents, which glisten like liquid gold. Then the heart lotus, blue or white, sometimes mixed with frankincense for strength. He pauses, as if weighing whether to share the final step. And finally, the secret ingredient, A little something only I know. His mouth curls into the smallest of smiles. You watch as he pours the warm, perfumed mixture into small cone-shaped molds. They're not perfectly symmetrical. Each one has its own quirks, its own tilt, but when they cool, they'll be polished with more powdered petals until they gleam. They must be stored carefully, he warns. Heat will ruin the scent before the ceremony. And never, ever let the river wind touch them too soon. You ask about the symbolism. He shrugs, as though the meaning is almost secondary to the pleasure. The gods enjoy fragrance. So do people. It's that simple. But his eyes betray something deeper. Maybe he knows the cones mark wealth, hospitality, even political power. The more fragrant the gathering, the more memorable the host. When he's done, he places a finished cone in your hand. It's surprisingly heavy, cool at first touch, and smells like an entire garden after rainstorm. You imagine it resting on your head, slowly releasing its essence into the world around you. Would it feel luxurious or slightly ridiculous? Probably both. As you leave the workshop, the city is waking fully now. Merchants roll open their stalls, fishermen shout from the docks, and somewhere a child laughs. The perfumed cone in your hand feels like a secret one you can carry into any gathering, one that can make a dusty evening feel like a divine celebration. You pass a small temple, and there, in the shadows, you notice something. A priest placing a cone not on his head, but at the foot of a statue. The wax is already softening in the morning heat, releasing its perfume upward toward the carved face of the god. It hits you then. Maybe these cones aren't just for the living. Maybe they're gifts meant to bridge world's luxury for humans, offering for the divine. The thought follows you all the way back to the river, where the water glints like molten bronze under the rising sun. Somewhere behind you, the perfumer is probably pouring another batch, shaping scent into solid form, preparing for the next night's gathering. And you realize here in ancient Egypt, fragrance isn't just an accessory. It's a statement, a memory, a prayer, and sometimes it's all three at once. By the time you wander back toward the palace district, the sun is already leaning high, flooding everything in a syrupy gold. The streets smell of baked bread, the tang of river mud, and faintly, that unmistakable perfume richer than any breeze off the Nile. You've seen where the cones are made, but now you want to see how they're worn, not in a smoky courtyard party, but in the bright, bustling heat of day. And as if the gods themselves are humoring you, a wedding procession appears at the end of the avenue. You hear it first, the rhythmic clap of sistrum rattles, the low beat of hand drums, the playful trills of reed flutes. Then the colors arrive, linen dyed in improbable shades of pomegranate, turquoise, and deep indigo, all flashing and swaying in the sunlight. At the center of it all walks the bride, serene as the moon, her black hair falling in perfect sheets over her shoulders. But it's the gleaming white cone on top of her head that steals your attention. Even from a distance, you can see it softening under the sun's gaze. A glisten of scented oil, slowly working its way down through her hair like a golden waterfall. The air around her smells like a bouquet in mid-bloom lotus, myrrh, and something spicy that tickles the back of your throat. You watch as the guests, each with their own smaller cones, laugh and chatter, their fragrances mixing into a heady cloud. Somewhere in the crowd, a child reaches up to touch his mother's cone, only to get his fingers oily and pull back with a face that says worth it. You slip into the procession, no one really stopping you, and soon you're walking alongside an older man with a cone tilted precariously on his head. He catches your curious glance and chuckles. First time seeing one worn in daylight? His voice is dry as the desert, but not unkind. It's not just for the parties, you know. Weddings, festivals, royal banquets, offerings, any excuse to smell better than your neighbor. He explains that the cone's melting isn't a flaw. It's the point. You see, the scent travels with the oil. It coats the hair, seeps into the skin. By the time the cone's gone, you're wearing the fragrance for the rest of the night, and sometimes into the next day, if you're lucky. You picture going to bed still smelling like a living bouquet, and imagine waking up to the faintest trace of last night's joy clinging to you. There is something both romantic and slightly impractical about it. Exactly the kind of thing that survives for centuries in memory. As the procession nears the temple, you notice the priests waiting at the entrance. Their cones are different, smaller, more symmetrical, their surfaces dusted with what looks like crushed lapis. Historians still argue whether these colors were symbolic or simply decorative. Maybe the blue suggested rebirth, or maybe it just looked beautiful against white linen. Either way, the effect is stunning. The ceremony begins with music and chanting. Every now and then, a shift in the wind sends the mingled perfumes washing over you, and for a moment, you almost forget you're standing on stone steps under a punishing sun. It's like the scent itself is a kind of shade, softening the edges of the day. The bride and groom exchange garlands, the priest mutters blessings, and the cones continue their slow melt, marking time in drips and fragrances instead of minutes. You realize that in this place, time isn't always measured by sundials or water clocks. Sometimes it is counted by how far the oil has run down someone's braid. When the rites are over, the guests spill into the temple courtyard, laughing and waving their arms to keep the flies away from the sweet oil. The bride's cone is almost gone now, her hair gleaming as if each strand has been individually polished. You catch her eye for a fleeting second, and there's a knowing smile there, like she understands that you've been watching the cones more than the vows. Someone hands you a cup of cool beer, and you raise it in thanks. The scent in the air is so thick you feel like you could drink it too. Around you, the wedding continues, songs, dances, plates of figs and honey, but your attention keeps drifting upward to those little fragrant peaks melting away in the sunlight. Eventually, you drift back toward the quieter streets, your skin warm, your senses buzzing. You carry the image with you. Cones marking life's milestones, fragrant crowns melting into memory. And though you have no cone yourself, you swear you catch a faint sweetness in your own hair as you pass through a shaft of golden light. Maybe it's nothing. Or maybe, just maybe, it's a gift left behind by the air you've been breathing all day. By the time the festival season rolls in, you've been in Thebes long enough to notice the subtle shift in the air, not just in temperature, but in mood. The markets buzz louder, the linen stalls shimmer with new bolts of fabric, and even the donkeys seem to walk with a little more purpose. Somewhere deep inside the temple complex, priests are already rehearsing hymns, and you hear whispers that the gods themselves might be tempted to come down, enjoying the celebrations, assuming they enjoy the smell. The festival you're walking toward today isn't a small neighborhood affair. This is Opet, the grand celebration when statues of the gods are carried through the city to renew the divine bond between pharaoh and people. You've been told the entire city will smell different by sundown, less like dust and sweat, more like a perfumery that's had too much wine. As you push through the crowd, you notice something striking. Almost every person you pass has a scented cone, but no two are exactly alike. Some are tall and elegant, others squat and lopsided, their surfaces flecked with petals or gold leaf. The richer citizens have cones so large they tilt like melting towers, threatening to slip off into the street. Children wear miniature cones, barely more than a lump of waxy perfume perched atop their heads, making them look like tiny pastries on parade. The smell is intoxicating, layers upon layers of fragrance. The base is always that rich, resinous myrrh and lotus. But mingled in are sharper notes, cinnamon bark for warmth, cardamom for brightness, and even, surprisingly, a faint whiff of cedar that makes you think of far-off ships docking with precious cargo. Somewhere to your left, a group of dancers sways past, their cones glistening under the midday sun. The movement makes the melted oils trickle faster down their braids. leaving faint glistening trails along their necks and shoulders. The crowd cheers them on, and you find yourself smiling at the simple joy of it all. A middle-aged man, his linen tunic already blotched from the melting cone atop his head, leans toward you conspiratorially. You know, he says, the gods can't resist a good scent. That's why we do this. We make ourselves smell so fine they'll have no choice but to bless us. Historians still argue whether scented cones were truly religious offerings, or simply a human indulgence that became wrapped in sacred tradition. Maybe it was both, because if you can smell divine and earn divine favor at the same time, why wouldn't you? The procession finally arrives, and the crowd roars as priests carry the gilded bark of almond through the avenue. The air thickens with incense smoke, swirling into the perfume from the melting cones until you can tell where one scent ends and the other begins. It's overwhelming, but in the best way, like standing inside a single giant breath of the gods. At one point, the bark stops so offerings can be placed inside. You watch as a young woman steps forward, kneels, and carefully removes her cone, setting it before the statue with a bowed head. The scent blooms instantly, carried upward by the heat rising from the paving stones. It is as if she is giving the god a piece of herself an hour, its worth of melting fragrance in a single concentrated gift. The festival spills into the evening. Torches flare to life, their flames reflecting off the oils running down people's hair, making them look like living sculptures. You pass a group sharing pomegranate wine, their laughter sticky in the warm air. Someone waves you over, and before you know it, you've been handed your own cone, smaller than most, but still fragrant, smelling faintly of mint and orange blossom. At first it feels strange, the waxy weight resting on your hair. But as it warms and begins to soften, you feel the slow, luxurious slide of scented oil seeping downward. The smell is addictive. You understand now why people might have worn these daily, why a marketplace could be a symphony of competing perfumes, why even the gods might pause in their celestial duties to inhale deeply. You find yourself wandering to the riverbank, watching the reflection of torchlight ripple over the dark water. The perfume drifts into the breeze, mingling with the smell of wet reeds and night air. Somewhere behind you, the festival drums still beat, calling the city to keep dancing. But you just stand there, feeling the warm weight of your cone, letting the scent do its quiet work. In that moment, you realize something important. These cones aren't just about smelling nice. They're a way of marking time, of tying memory to scent so tightly that a single whiff, years later, could summon an entire evening back into existence. And tonight, as the last of your cone melts away, you know this festival will stay with you forever, tucked away in some corner of your mind that smells faintly of lotus and firelight. The next morning, the streets of Thebes smell like the fading echo of last night's celebration. The perfume hasn't entirely vanished. It lingers in the air like the memory of a dream, softer now, almost wistful. You walk past a closed linen shop, and from the inside drifts the faint scent of lotus oil, stubbornly clinging to the fabrics from the festival. It's as if the whole city is still wearing an invisible cone, the scent unwinding slowly with the new day's heat. The marketplace, however, is already stirring again. Scribes with ink-stained fingers stroll between stalls. Merchants shout over the clink of copper weights. And somewhere, a baker pulls hot bread from an oven, sending a fresh cloud of barley and sesame into the air. But alongside the ordinary morning smells, bread, dust, animals, comes something new. People are replenishing their cones. You spot a vendor who wasn't here yesterday. An older woman with hair streaked white, her stall piled high with trays of cones in every shade of gold and cream. Some are embedded with flower petals, others swirled with streaks of reddish resin, like miniature sunsets. She catches your eye and motions you closer. "You look like you wore your first cone last night," she says, her voice a blend of warmth and teasing. You admit that yes, you did, and she nods knowingly. It gets into your blood, or perhaps your soul. Either way, you'll come back. Her hands move with the speed of habit as she shapes a fresh cone from a lump of warm, pliable resinous paste. She works in layers first, a base of myrrh and tallow, then a middle of crushed lotus petals, and finally, a drizzle of cedar oil that darkens the top to a soft amber. As she presses it into a small conical mold, she talks. "These are not just for beauty," she says, "and not just for the gods. They keep sickness away. The oils are cleansing stronger than the Nile wind. Wear one in the heat, and you will breathe easier." It strikes you that in a time before soap and perfume counters, before bottles and atomizers, this might have been as close to daily hygiene as luxury. A cone could mask the scent of sweat, repel insects, and possibly even carry medicinal benefits. It was an accessory, but also a little portable pharmacy melting down your hair. You buy one, not because you believe entirely in its healing powers, but because the smell is impossible to resist. She wraps it in a scrap of linen, and the oil immediately seeps into the fibers, marking them with that unmistakable scent. You tuck it carefully into your satchel, already imagining the slow melt over the course of a hot afternoon. Later, you find yourself near a scribe school, where boys practice copying hymns to Hathor, goddess of joy, music, and beauty. One of them, a lanky youth with a streak of ink across his cheek, pauses to wave at you. "Hathor loves the scent of lotus," he says with authority. "If you wish to please her, wear it often. The sweeter you smell, the more she will smile on you." You notice he's wearing a tiny cone himself, barely the size of a date seed, but still fragrant. Perhaps even students, with little to their name, invest in these scents as a way to stay in the gods' favor. Or perhaps they simply like the way it makes them feel cleaner, lighter, a little more divine. As the day warms, you pass a group of workers repairing a mud brick wall. Sweat darkens their tunics, but several of them wear cones, their oils glistening in the sun. It's an odd contrast, the grit and strain of labor softened by the shimmer of perfume. You can almost imagine the oils serving as armor against the relentlessness of the heat and the dust. By late afternoon, you wander toward the temple district again, drawn by the sound of music. A small procession winds its way through the streets, not as grand as the Opet festival, but still richly scented. This one seems to honor a lesser-known deity, a protective household god. The priests carry a small statue on a litter, and the air smells of mint and cinnamon, sharp and fresh. You watch as the crowd kneels to place offerings, flowers, bread, and of course, cones. One man removes his cone and places it directly at the god's feet, where the sun melts it faster, pooling fragrant oil on the stone. A priest bends down, dips his fingers into the warm liquid, and anoints the man's forehead. The man's face relaxes, as though the scent has carried away a burden he'd deep been holding. It occurs to you that this is another layer of the cone's purpose. It is not just worn for the self, but for sharing. The scent can be gifted, spread, transferred. It can sanctify a moment, seal a prayer, or soothe the spirit. In a way, the cones are like slow-burning candles you carry on your body, releasing lightless flame into the air around you. By sunset, the city smells different again, still fragrant, but with the sharp edges of the day smoothed out. You sit by the riverbank, your new cone still tucked away in linen, and think about how scent here is more than a luxury. It's part of the rhythm of life, marking celebrations and daily chores alike. And as the first evening breeze rolls off the Nile, carrying with it the mingled perfumes of the city, you realize that in Thebes, to smell beautiful is to live beautifully. Next day dawns with the faintest veil of mist over the Nile, a soft haze that seems to slow the city's usual rush into wakefulness. From your window, you can see the light turning the water into molten gold. Somewhere below, a boatman calls to his crew, and the oars dip into the current with a rhythm older than the temples themselves. The air is cooler in these early hours, but even now, a trace of last night's perfumes lingers, as if the city refuses to wake without carrying the dreams of its scents into daylight. Today, you decide to explore the source of the ingredients that make the cones possible. The marketplace is a lively place to start, but your destination lies deeper, a narrow row of spice and oil traders, tucked between the grain merchants and the weavers. The first stall you enter is more of a shadowed cave than a shop, its shelves stacked with ceramic jars sealed with beeswax. The keeper, a man with fingers stained dark from handling resins, welcomes you with a nod and peels away a seal from one jar. Inside is something that looks like polished amber, warm to the touch even in the shade. Myrrh, he says, his voice almost reverent. It comes from across the sea. We trade gold for it. He chips off a small piece and crushes it in his palm. Immediately, a warm, almost medicinal sweetness fills the air. You realize that myrrh is one of the most important anchors in a cone. It deepens the scent, keeps it from vanishing too quickly, and gives it that grounding quality that stays even when lighter floral notes fade. At the next stall, the air is fresher, almost sharp. The trader is a woman with a green scarf wrapped around her hair, and she sells bundles of mint, dried sage, and sprigs of blue lotus flowers. The lotus she handles delicately, as if each petal could dissolve into air. She explains that they must be dried just enough to release their fragrance without losing their color. The gods notice the color as much as the scent, she says with a knowing smile. A little further down, you find the cedar oil vendor. His shop smells like a forest in the middle of the desert, resinous, cool, slightly smoky. The oil is kept in small alabaster jars, each stoppered with a plug of soft cloth soaked in the oil itself. This keeps it from spoiling. He explains, handing you a jar so you can feel its weight. The oil is heavier than water, clinging to your fingertips when you touch it. It has this cling that allows the cone to melt slowly, rather than dripping away too quickly in the heat. The most striking stall of all, however, belongs to a man who sells only fat-pure, pale tallow. Without it, none of the perfumes could be shaped into cones. His tallow is scented faintly of the herbs he mixes into it for preservation, and it's stored in cool, shaded pots buried halfway into the ground to keep them firm. You realize now how much the cones depend on simple, unglamorous ingredients as much as the rare ones. Without the fat, the scent would have no form, no vessel to ride upon into the air. By midday, you've gathered a mental map of the city's scent economy. Each cone is a collaboration, farmers growing flowers along the Nile, traders bringing in resins from far-off lands, oil pressers extracting fragrance from cedarwood, and skilled makers blending them all with tallow into those perfect little pyramids. The cone is not just an object. It's a story of many hands, many miles, and many trades. You decide to visit one of the cone-making workshops, tucked away behind a courtyard filled with drying petals. The air here is intoxicating, so many scents swirling together that you can't separate them at first. A young apprentice, her hair tied back with a strip of linen, shows you the process. First, the tallow is gently warmed until it's soft but not liquid. Into it, she stirs the powdered petals, ground resins, and measured drops of oil. She works quickly, because in the warm air, the mixture can harden too fast. Once the blend is ready, it's packed into small clay molds, perfectly smooth on the inside, so that the finished cone will slip out without sticking. The molds are left in the shade to firm up, and when they are opened, each cone emerges glossy and flawless. The apprentice polishes the sides with a cloth dipped in more oil, giving them a subtle sheen that catches the light. She offers you one fresh, warm from the mold. The surface is so soft, it almost yields to your touch. She tells you it will smell strongest now, but even if stored, the scent will deepen over weeks, like wine maturing in a sealed jar. You find yourself imagining buying several and tucking them away for future moments' meals with friends, festivals, or simply hot days when the air needs sweetening. By the time you leave, The sun has moved high overhead, and the city's streets shimmer in the heat. Carrying your newly made cone in a small palm leaf basket, you feel oddly protective of it, aware of the work, the time, and the faraway lands that brought it into being. As you walk back toward the river, the breeze shifts, and the scent rises to meet you. It's not just fragrance now. It's history, economy, craftsmanship, and devotion captured in something small enough to fit in your hand, yet big enough to fill a city square. The afternoon sun leans heavily over Thebes, and you notice the city's energy changing. Morning's bustle has given way to a slower, more deliberate rhythm, as if everyone is bracing for the hottest hours. The river's surface glitters like hammered bronze, and the breeze, when it comes, carries both heat and the faint breath of flowers from gardens tucked behind mud brick walls. You decide to seek shade and observe how the cones are actually worn during everyday life, not just in the careful stillness of temples or the staged elegance of banquets. Crossing through the central square, you find a group of women selling linen scarves, each dyed with subtle patterns in ochre and indigo. Behind them, under a striped awning, sits a hairdresser. She works with a kind of calm precision, arranging coils and braids atop a young woman's head. And there, nestled into the highest knot of hair, is a small, creamy cone. Up close, you see the artistry. The cone I sent tea simply placed there, it is anchored with pins of carved bone, tilted ever so slightly, so that its melting will trail down along the strands of hair, releasing scent evenly. The hairdresser explains that a skilled arrangement allows the perfume to drift toward the wearer as shoulders and neck without dripping too quickly. It should be like the voice of a lute, she says, never too loud, never too soft. Nearby, a group of merchants sit in the shade of a fig tree, cups of beer sweating in their hands. One of them wears a comb balanced atop his short, tightly curled hair. At first, you think it odd for a man to wear such an adornment in this casual setting, but he catches your glance and grins. Trade deals go better, he says, when everyone smells like prosperity. The others laugh, but you can't help noticing how the warm, spicy scent around him seems to set him apart. Later, you find yourself wandering into the courtyard of a weaving house. Long strips of linen are strung between posts, drying in the sun after being rinsed. A worker there is humming as she ties the cloth in bundles. She wears no jewelry, no painted eyes, but in her hair sits a small cone, the edges already glistening under the heat. The scent here is sharper, less floral, more herbal. She explains that her cones are made with mint and rosemary, keeping her alert during long hours at the loom. Flowers are for sleeping, she says with a shrug. I need to stay awake. The cones, you realize, are as varied as the people themselves. Not everyone seeks the same fragrance. Each blend tells a different story. Some choose heavy, resinous perfumes for rituals or trade. Others prefer light florals for love and leisure. And still others want sharp, invigorating scents for work. It's less about fashion than about purpose, though beauty never seems far from anyone's mind. As the afternoon drags on, you retreat into the shaded colonnade of a temple complex, not for worship, but for coolness. Here, the air is heavy with the smell of incense burning on altars. But in the quiet side chambers, you notice something unexpected. The scribes, hunched over papyrus, each have a cone set upon their linen caps. It melts slowly in the dim air, the fragrance mixing with the faint mineral scent of ink. One of them, pausing to stretch his fingers, tells you that the cones help keep moths and other insects away from the papyrus scrolls. The gods may smell the prayers, he says with a sly smile, but we smell the ink. By now, the sun has dipped just enough to soften the light, turning everything into shades of gold and rose. You follow the winding streets back toward the river, your mind swirling with impressions. The hairdresser's careful tilt, the merchant's spicy advantage in trade, the weaver's herbal sharpness, the scribe's perfumed protection for his scrolls. It strikes you that in this city, scent is not just decoration. It's woven into the fabric of life. It works like the Nile itself, flowing through work, rest, trade, and devotion, shaping the mood of the day as surely as the river shapes the land. And in the middle of it all sits the humble, elegant scented cone, melting quietly into the hours. When you reach your lodging, the cone you bought that morning is waiting. The air inside is warm and still. You place it carefully on your head, just as you were shown, and sit near the open window. Outside, the city exhales into evening. Inside, the scent rises your own small river, flowing unseen into the coming night. Night begins to drape itself over Thebes like a heavy linen shawl, and you wander toward the sound of distant drums and the flicker of torches. A festival is underway, one of those rare occasions where the city seems to hum in unison, a pulse of music, chatter, and laughter. Merchants have cleared spaces for temporary stalls. Acrobats practice flips on the edges of shadowed courtyards. And somewhere, a small troupe of dancers rehearses in a courtyard, the swish of their skirts catching torchlight. It is here, amid this tapestry of activity, that you see scented cones in their most elaborate public form. The festival is dedicated to Hathor, goddess of joy, music, and perfume. And the air vibrates with her presence, or at least with a human attempt to summon her. Women have wound their hair into towers, each adorned with cones of varying size and color: pale cream, honey gold, and deep amber. Men, too, have joined in the fragrant display, a few daringly sporting cones above the rigid bands of their short-cropped hair. As you move through the crowd, the fragrances mix sweet frankincense, sharp myrrh, soft florals, and hints of cinnamon, creating a layered perfume that is both intoxicating and grounding. Historians still argue whether these festivals were primarily religious, social, or just a chance to see who could wear the largest, most fragrant cone. You watch as a young girl steps carefully through the crowd, balancing a tall, carved cone on the top of her elaborate hairstyle. Her steps are measured, and every movement seems choreographed to prevent the cone from tilting or sliding. A sudden gust of wind makes her cone wobble. You hold your breath, but she adjusts imperceptibly, tilting her head as if the balance of her hair were a secret ritual known only to her. Fringe scholars suggest that these cones may have functioned as early status symbols, with height and ornamentation correlating to family wealth or influence. You, observing quietly, cannot help but marvel at the interplay of fashion, function, and human ingenuity. Nearby, a group of young men are performing what looks like a playful contest. Who can wear the heaviest cone while moving through the festival without toppling it? They stumble, laugh, and straighten each other's cones. One of them boasts that his cone contains a secret blend of crushed lotus and honey, giving him divine stability. The crowd chuckles, and the scent wafts outward, mingling with the more traditional aromas of myrrh and cinnamon. You notice how scent acts as both armor and identity in this space. It tells the story of families, trades, and sometimes hidden secrets. In another corner, musicians have set up near a reflecting pool. As the lyres, flutes, and drums begin to play, the cones respond in a way you hadn't anticipated. The warmth of torches, combined with the gentle breeze from the pool, sends a delicate aroma rising and twisting through the air, almost as if the scent itself dances. The Egyptians seemed attuned to this, selecting cone ingredients, not only for fragrance, but for their subtle interaction with heat, wind, and human motion. It's mesmerizing. One theorist even posits that the cones served as an olfactory equivalent to music, setting the emotional tone of ceremonies and gatherings. You move toward the food stalls, where women offer dates, honey cakes, and small pastries filled with spiced grains. Each vendor wears her cone slightly different, some dripping slowly like molten amber, others sharp and pointed. The interplay between food smells and perfumed cones is a sensory overload, but a strangely soothing one. It's as if each scent has a deliberate purpose, guiding attention, suggesting status, or simply offering delight. A merchant explains that cones can also keep flies and other pests away from food during outdoor gatherings, a practical bonus to their aesthetic and ceremonial roles. The night deepens and torches flicker in the darkness. You notice a small procession forming, priests, attendants, and musicians moving toward a temple courtyard. Those wearing cones seem to gain a kind of reverent gravity. The scent is a tangible link between mortal and divine, each aroma a whisper of ritual significance. You follow quietly, feeling the cone's warmth and fragrance blend with the murmurs of prayers and the low hum of lyres. By the time you leave the festival, walking along streets still shimmering with torchlight and echoing laughter, you are enveloped in the lingering perfume of cedar, cinnamon, and floral resin. The cones, from humble homes to grand ceremonies, appear as more than fashion. They are an invisible thread connecting the city's daily rhythm, social hierarchy, and spiritual life. Walking back to your lodging, you wonder how many scents you will remember tomorrow, and how much of this sensory tapestry influenced even the most mundane acts in the city. Morning light spills over the Nile, painting the mud brick walls of Thebes in soft gold, and you follow the quiet streets toward a private household. Here, away from the spectacle of festivals and public ceremonies, scented cones take on a different, more intimate role. Women and men alike have begun their daily rituals, lighting small fires to warm oils and soften beeswax. Preparing cones not for display, but for personal comfort, meditation, or even what they called heart clarity. Historians still argue whether these private uses were strictly spiritual, a matter of hygiene, or an early attempt at aromatherapy, though the results, whether symbolic or physiological, are undeniable. You step into a courtyard where a matron carefully rolls her cone. She sprinkles crushed flowers and resins into the mix, humming softly to herself. The scent rises slowly, mingling with the crisp morning air and the faint odor of cooking grains from the kitchen. Nearby, a young servant fanfully carries water and oils, pausing to adjust the cone atop her mistress's head. There's a rhythm here, a choreography of scent, sound, and movement. Fringe scholars have noted that the cone's melting process often mirrors natural cycles. The rising sun warms the wax, releasing fragrance gradually, almost like a timed alarm for the senses. Inside the house, the cone's purpose becomes functional as well as aesthetic. Some Egyptians used them to repel insects from sleeping areas, while others believed the scents could influence mood, ward off nightmares, or even guide dreams. You watch as the matron inhales deeply, letting the fragrance fill her lungs. She places a small incense burner beside her sleeping child. The aroma curls in slow spirals above woven mats. You notice that even in private, the cone is a vessel of attention, an instrument of intention as much as a decorative object. Elsewhere, a scholar sits cross-legged on a woven mat, surrounded by scrolls and small clay containers of oils, honey, and herbs. He tests small cones, writing annotations in faded ink. Each combination of resin, honey, and floral matter produces a different effect, subtle enough that only years of experience could register the difference. He murmurs to himself about clarity of mind and fortitude of heart, and you can't help but wonder whether these were early experiments in sensory psychology. Historians still debate whether such practices were widely understood or mostly confined to elite households with the leisure to explore scent as a discipline. You follow the path of another household, where scented cones serve a quasi-medical role. A mother carefully prepares a cone to place near her husband, who suffers from restlessness. She incorporates frankincense and a pinch of myrrh, believing these to have cooling properties. Nearby, a small clay jar of water is left to boil, releasing steam that mingles with the warming wax and resin, amplifying the scent's reach. Fringe theories suggest that some cones were even used as preventive measures against common illnesses, though no clear consensus exists among scholars. You inhale, noting how the mingling aromas can be simultaneously soothing and invigorating, a paradox perhaps intended by those who crafted them. In a quieter corner of the household, you notice a young girl practicing with miniature cones, placing them on dolls' heads. The cones are tiny and delicate, yet she treats them with the same care she would a living ritual. This practice seems to teach precision, patience, and reverence for scent from a young age. Scholars still argue whether these exercises were primarily educational, ceremonial, or simply playful, though the care involved mirrors adult rituals, suggesting that scent education was an integral part of upbringing. By midday, the household buzz slows to a gentle rhythm. Cones sit melting gently on stone ledges, releasing subtle notes of lotus, myrrh, and honey. You follow the scent trail, realizing that these small waxen objects, so often dismissed as cosmetic, form an invisible architecture of daily life. They mark boundaries, signal social roles, and mediate between the human and divine. Even in silence, they speak volumes in olfactory language you are only beginning to understand. You leave the household, carrying the faint aroma of warm resins in your clothing, and walk toward the open markets, reflecting on how scent, intention, and ritual have intertwined in these private moments. The Egyptians' obsession with scented cones was not mere vanity. It was a sophisticated, multisensory engagement with the world, blending practicality, spirituality, and aesthetic pleasure. As the sun reaches its zenith, you notice that even the smallest streets and courtyards seem infused with this invisible artistry, reminding you that scent shaped both public and private life, leaving a lingering presence that time cannot entirely erase. The temple rises before you, a monumental labyrinth of sandstone, sun-warmed and redolent with centuries of devotion. You trudge up the worn steps, the scent of incense mingling with the dry, dust-laden heat of the day. Here, scented cones take on a far more ceremonial and public role. Priests and priestesses prepare long, tapered cones, carefully embedding them with frankincense, myrrh, lotus petals, and crushed resins. The wax is softened over gentle fires, stirred slowly, and molded with meticulous precision. Historians still argue whether the exact proportions of these ingredients were standardized or left to the discretion of individual temple attendants. But one thing is clear: the resulting fragrance was as much a part of worship as chants or offerings. You follow a priestess as she carefully places a large cone atop her headdress, balancing it like a crown. The wax warms from her body heat, releasing a delicate, ever-expanding cloud of perfume. Fringe scholars have suggested that some temple cones were designed to release their aroma over several hours, almost like an invisible clock marking the sequence of prayers and rituals. You can help but marvel at the engineering behind something so seemingly simple, a functional object doubling as an aromatic marker of sacred time. Around the inner sanctum, worshippers kneel and bow, heads bowed beneath the drifting scent. The smell is intoxicating, but not overpowering, designed to focus the mind and attune it to the divine presence. You notice a young scribe recording the preparations, taking note of which cones accompany certain offerings to gods like Osiris or Hathor. Historians still debate whether these recorded recipes reflect a religious canon or an evolving tradition tailored to seasonal and festival variations. You inhale the mingling scents of honey, resins, and petals, and it is almost as if the air itself becomes a conduit to the gods. In the courtyard, artisans demonstrate how cones were made for processions. They craft intricate layers, sometimes adding colorants from ochre or lapis lazuli dust to enhance their visual appeal. Though primarily symbolic, these visual details may have enhanced the sense of ceremony and occasion. Fringe theorists argue that the layering of scents and colors could correspond to astrological beliefs, aligning the sensory experience with cosmic cycles. You walk past trays of freshly molded cones, each one emitting a subtle, lingering fragrance that seems to hover in anticipation of the ritual to come. Nearby, a group of novices is learning the delicate art of cone placement. One carefully balances a cone on a stone statue of Anubis, observing how the wax softens in the sun, releasing the aroma gradually. Another is practicing on the headdress of a statue of Hathor, noting the patterns in which the scent wafts through the temple corridors. You notice that cones were not just decorative, they were instruments of air movement and focus, guiding attention as much as marking space. Historians still argue whether these practices were largely symbolic or whether the effects were intended to produce tangible physiological or psychological responses in worshippers. You step into a small side chamber where the high priest is demonstrating a particular ritual, the offering of a cone to the god Ra at noon. The priest places the cone atop a shallow stone altar, and as the sun's rays strike the wax, the scent rises in a golden haze. The aroma is designed to align with chanting, and you can almost hear the invisible pattern it weaves through the temple air. Fringe scholars have speculated that this sensory orchestration might be an early form of experiential ritual, designed to immerse participants fully and temporarily suspend the mundane concerns of daily life. You feel that immersive quality, now the combination of scent, light, and sound forming an enveloping, almost hypnotic atmosphere. Elsewhere in the temple, cones serve as instruments of purification. Priests wave them gently above sacred water basins, their fragrance mingling with the cool dampness of the water, creating a layered olfactory experience. Worshippers are thought to inhale these scents to symbolically cleanse the mind and body before prayer. Scholars still debate whether this cleansing function was primarily metaphorical, an actual attempt at spiritual hygiene, or a subtle manipulation of mood and alertness through scent. You note how even the smallest details, the angle of a cone, the timing of its melting, the combination of ingredients, demonstrate a highly sophisticated understanding of sensory influence. You are led through another corridor where cones are being burned during funerary rites. The scent is heavier here, mingled with oils designed to preserve both body and memory. Priests carefully arrange cones on altars beside the deceased, ensuring the aroma reaches every corner of the tomb chamber. Fringe theorists suggest that some cones may have been intended to replicate divine fragrances, allowing the dead to experience a symbolic communion with gods even after passing. You step lightly, aware that these objects wax, resin, honey carry a weight far beyond their humble materials, functioning as bridges between worlds, the living and the divine. Finally, the main hall opens before you, filled with a congregation gathered for a festival in honor of Hathor. Scented cones melt slowly atop the heads of priestesses, on altars, and even along the floors, creating a layered aroma that seems to envelop the entire temple. You notice the interplay of sunlight, stone, and scent. The air itself seems choreographed, as if the temple were breathing. Historians still argue whether such orchestrations were meant to induce trance states, encourage social cohesion, or simply celebrate the artistry of scent. You can't help but breathe deeply, feeling the centuries of practice and devotion lingering in every inhalation. Walking slowly through the temple exit, you feel the lingering aroma of melted wax and resins clinging to your clothes and hair. The scent trail leads you past the bustling market outside, where miniature cones are sold for personal devotion in private households. You realize that while temples showcase the grandeur and ceremonial importance of scented cones, the same principles trickled down to everyday life, connecting the spiritual and domestic spheres. Fringe scholars point out that some cones even doubled as early symbolic gifts, exchanged between families and communities to mark milestones or convey messages of goodwill. As you step back into the bright sunlight outside, the temple behind you continues to exhale its fragrant history. Scented cones, once private and now public, emerge as one of the most fascinating threads in Egypt's tapestry objects that shaped perception, guided ritual, and carried both the ordinary and extraordinary on invisible currents of aroma. You take a final deep breath, savoring the lingering notes of lotus, honey, and myrrh, knowing that you've glimpsed only a fraction of their significance.